Good afternoon, everybody. It's a wonderful afternoon in cold, windy Harare, and it's promising to be a great show. We've got a good friend to the show, Gloria. Thank you very much for coming. I mean, look at you, your regalia. You look so regal, so what, African queen.
You're crazy.
Have you watched the movie?
You're making Tinashe look underdressed.
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
You know, I actually didn't know what to wear, but I managed to put something together. You'll be surprised what this is.
Well, we'll learn a lot more after. And Rufaro, Shumba Bazwese.
Yes.
Yeah, how are you doing?
No, good. I'm quite chuffed. Yesterday was the winter solstice, so it's supposed to be the coldest day. So it's, we're going to see the back of winter and back to sunny, warm days.
I must say it hasn't been that cold.
No, it's definitely better than last year.
Chilly, but
Yeah.
Can't complain. What are you having? What are you drinking?
Yeah, so because of the weather, I thought, I definitely don't want to drink anything that I want to put ice in or that's going to be cold. And I wasn't feeling brave enough to drink whiskey neat. So I went with the trusted old friend, the Chocolate Block. It's a South African Bordeaux blend. And it's one of the better ones. And it's a shame that I'm not going to share it with anyone today.
Well, and Gloria, what are you having?
I'm having Campari and orange.
Oh, what is a Campari?
It's a liqueur.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I hope that will help you because we've got lots and lots of questions.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a headmistress in town, and that is the reason why we started on time.
Yeah, because we never start on time.
No. She was, SMSing and sending messages. She's like, you know what, we need to start this on time. I was like, we hardly ever start on time.
Well, I was scared to be late, so
Oh, no, but
at least I made it on time.
yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you very much. So what are we going to discuss today? But before we do that, what we're going to do is to just introduce our guest. She sent, a litany of stuff and things that she's done. So I'm not going to go through it. I'm actually going to ask her to just tell her and tell our audience a little bit about yourself. This is Gloria Ndoro Mkombachoto. I've known Gloria for a while.
Yes, I remember exactly how we met. Yeah,
Sparring on Facebook.
Yes, we were on Magaisa's page.
Oh, yes.
But I think we had met on Pettina's page.
Oh, yes.
And this friend of yours has got academic arrogance. And he was
Just arrogance. You don't have to say academic.
Scrutinizing everything. Then he asked a question on the secret, it's called the separate corporate persona.
Yes.
Yes, and then Alex was going to do a lecture at the University of Kent. So he said, I'm rushing to a lecture. But because I did business law, corporate law, and commercial law in my first degree, I then came and plastered what you needed. And then you went quiet for a while. Then Alex came back and then he said, oh, thank you, Gloria, for saving me. That's when he started talking. But earlier, we had met at Pettina Gapa's page, and we were talking about who's vulnerable and who isn't around domestic workers. And you were saying that they are poor. And I said, no, they are not poor. They are vulnerable. And then I gave I think it was a UNDP or ILO definition of what vulnerability is. Again, you kept quiet. Later on, we decided, okay, I think there is common ground here. We then decided to meet, and here we are.
Lots of sparring.
Yes, in a long time.
Well, it gets my blood going,
Yeah.
Yes, Tinashe is nothing if not an argumentative human being.
Yeah.
But in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way.
I debate issues. I'm not argumentative, but I debate issues. And I think today will be a combination of that because, this is one area in which you can teach us quite a bit because you've seen all the characters involved.
Well, I'm not sure. I consider myself a student of the universe. And one of the things I like having a good friendship with you is precisely because I also learn from you. So it's not about me only. You had asked a question earlier, and I do not know where to start from, because when I was your age, I was operating at supersonic speed. I started off my career actually at the University of Zimbabwe, and I was lecturing in the accounting department for about 3 years. Then I left and went into banking, Zim Bank. It was just the time when we were moving away from socialism towards perhaps a market-led economy, and I joined the banking sector. Every bank was setting up a small business division to support small and medium-sized enterprises. So I set up the division for Zim Bank, left, went to Standard Chartered Merchant Bank in corporate finance. And when I was there, I realized the opportunities in consulting. So I started consulting, and then got an opportunity to go to Cape Town to lecture at the university, was hired by a top consulting company. And it has been consulting, lecturing, consulting for the World Bank, IFC, UNDP, Danida, USAID, you name it, but also for listed companies in Zimbabwe, Sidco, Wange Colliery, assisting them in doing their strategies. In South Africa, I've done a lot of strategies when I was with either Deloitte or at Wits Business School where I taught, or Stellenbosch Business School where I taught as well, and UCT. So I've done so much. I've also gone to Afghanistan. And,
what were you doing in Afghanistan?
I was with the United Nations. I was doing an evaluation there for women. You know, women are not allowed to be involved in business. So they've got what they call a women's garden. And that's where women are allowed to do their entrepreneurial activities. And the Italian corporation had set up 4 businesses for women. And my role was to go there after 3 years to do an evaluation on whether they should carry on with businesses or terminate them or plow in some more money. And so they outsourced to, it was UNIFEM that time, it's now UN Women, and I went and I did the evaluation. It was a 4-month assignment. But you realize when you get into certain spaces that your education is useless. So I got there, and you are trying to extract information from women who are covered in a burqa. They can see you, but you can't see them. So how do you extract information? So I went to my room at the UN compound, prayed about it, and the message that came from the Lord was, take your education, put it in file 13, and start interacting as a human being. So that's what I did for the first 2 months. I'll take my computer, photos of my family and friends, and I would say we are doing showing and telling. And then we were giggling about girly things, how do you meet husbands, you name it. And the burqa started coming off. And the information started flowing. And that's how I did the evaluation.
Wonderful. We hope to hear more of that. So how we're going to structure this is we're going to talk about Black entrepreneurship, pre-independence, post-independence, and we're going to do it, with the decades. So we'll go through pre-independence and we'll talk about the great Black entrepreneurship then we'll do the 80s, 90s, right through. And we want to focus on what we term the golden era and what happened. And there's this uneasy relationship between Black entrepreneurs or business people and the government. But before we do that, because it's the producer's show, he put this out on Twitter and he said, failure of Black entrepreneurship in Zimbabwe, who is to blame? And I got a lot of flack for this on Twitter, and a lot of people. And the question was, have we failed as Black entrepreneurs? And what I want to do is ask you, Rufaro, what did the producer mean by this?
Yeah, so
do you take it that we've actually failed?
So I don't agree with the premise, of failure of black entrepreneurs. So I pushed back on Twitter as well. I said, look, and I'm going to do it on the show to say, we have actually had some great, very successful entrepreneurs on our show. We've had Philip Mataranyika, who's built the Nyaraza Group, which is doing extremely well. We also had Much, who built the Pulse Pharmaceutical Group, which is doing quite well. Yes, there have been a litany of failures, in the black entrepreneurial community.
All right, I'm going to hold you there because this was a rhetorical question.
Yes.
And what we want to do is we're going to put it out there and we're going to ask the audience this same question at the end of the show. That after we've gone through everybody, the decades, we will ask the same question right at the end. And what we want to establish is, at the end, have we answered this question?
Sure.
And would we have an answer to this particular question? But as a lecturer, the first thing that I want to understand from you, Gloria, is maybe let's look at what constitutes success or failure of any entrepreneurial activity, or maybe what is an entrepreneur to you?
Well, I would like to answer the first part. And in answering the first part, then I hope I would have answered the second part of the question. Obviously, when you set out to take calculated risks, because you can't just take any other risk, it has to be calculated according to you. And the calculation of risk is relative. So you take a calculated risk, and the ultimate goal is to make a profit. That is the standard. But for me, success entails more. To make a profit in a business is generic. Otherwise, what is the point of you getting into business? But when you go beyond, and when I'm talking about beyond, I'm talking about, for example, philanthropy. For me, African philanthropy is particularly important because when I look around Zimbabwe, for example, having lived in other countries, I find that there are very few successful businesses or businessmen and women who set aside resources to give to the community. That's serving them.
So you're saying the entrepreneurial activity is beyond just profit?
Of course.
It's all-encompassing, which is very interesting because when we start the pre-independence, yes, so colonial era black business people, we see this, what I would term a holy alliance between the black business people who obviously were seeking profit and the liberation war struggle. And we're going to get into that. Yeah. But to begin with, can you please explain to us, give us color, who were some of the business people that were in Zimbabwe, pre-1980, and what are some of their names? We know Ben Mucheche has just passed on.
Oh, yes.
96.
May his soul rest in peace.
Absolutely. And he was a phenomenal business person.
Yes, lived a colorful life.
Very.
Had a great sense of humor.
6 wives, 26 kids.
No, he had 4 wives, I think 24 kids and 56 grandchildren. And I think he's got great-grandchildren as well.
Yeah, what a man.
Yeah. You liked that when we were talking about it earlier. You said men like these are not being made anymore. I must tell you, I'm not totally opposed to polygamy.
Right.
I think it's a personal choice.
Yeah.
Personally, I would not succumb to it, but those who want to, I don't judge them. I think it's a personal choice, and in our society and in our culture, I believe that there is a role for it.
Absolutely.
And it must be accommodated.
Does it speak to that Umdoda Sibili that these black entrepreneurs had during that time? I mean, this is a guy who started a black transport business and, against all odds. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think when you look at pre-colonial years, there were certain traits and issues that guided us. And I also want to indicate that the pre-colonial the entrepreneurs that were in business before independence, I'm going to call them the pioneer entrepreneurs.
Okay.
They were the pioneers. They took a risk in a society amongst black people where to be an entrepreneur was considered a low caliber job.
Okay.
You would always hear adults say, but they're in business because they failed to go to school, which actually was a misnomer for the Ngamuka family because Mr. Ngamuka had a master's in sciences, I think. So the majority of them, I believe that they were true entrepreneurs because they saw gaps in the market. And if you look at where they were prevalent in the transport industry. That's why you had Matambanadzo bus service, Mucheche bus service, Ruredzo. A lot of people went into haulage trucks and transportation. There was one lady called Mrs. Edwards who had Rutendo bus service.
All right.
And where was this gap in the market? The colonial government wasn't providing transport.
So they were allowed by the
They were
colonial
allowed,
government. Okay.
and they were given operating licenses to operate in those spaces. But there were many other entrepreneurs. In Mutare, there was Msabaika. I think he also had buses, but I also believe he had a diversified portfolio. The Nyandoros, Mr. Nyandoro and his wife, Auntie Inga, they had shops, they were in retail. In Bulawayo, you had the Vera family. They were big, again, in retail. People want to refer to them as mom and pop operations. It really doesn't matter. It paid the bills.
I mean, if you look at the Matambanadzo bus services at its peak, 1978, they had 150 buses, 20 haulage trucks, and they were quite significant.
They were the largest, actually.
They were the largest.
They were the largest amongst the pioneers. And
where did they get the capital? I mean, there are these allegations that some of them were backed by white people. Where did they get the capital to?
Unless there is empirical evidence to actually show us that that's what happened, we'll assume that they mobilized funding either from family or friends. But with Mr. Matambanadzo specifically, he started off with one truck, which he converted into a bus. And that's how he built his fleet.
So, but if they got support from whites at some stage, does it matter? Who cares?
Well, then they were surrogates. That's the allegation.
Not necessarily. They could maybe they got loans or some.
Well, I was going to get into that because later on we get into the issue of funding because capital is quite key in any business. So what I wanted to find out is how did the banks view them? Were banks open to funding them, or it was just a question of just their savings and making profit and just growing organically?
I believe that during that time, there were certain concessions that were being made by the Rhodesian government.
Okay.
These guys were organized, the transport guys were organized into the Rhodesia Transport Operators Association. And that association, which later became, after independence, the Zimbabwe Transporters
ZUA.
ZUA was good at lobbying government.
The white government?
The white government, yes. They had conversations with them. And that's another thing that perhaps is lacking nowadays, where you need strong business associations that lobby government. And lobbying entails also educating government about the challenges that we are facing in the marketplace. So because the colonial government understood the needs in all the sectors, and they left certain sectors or subsectors within industries for black people to operate. That's how the pioneers entered into business.
So as a black person, you could be in retail?
You could be in retail.
Wholesale?
Wholesale, yes.
So transport?
Wholesale.
Farming? Mining?
In the African purchase areas.
Okay.
You were not allowed...
Please explain to us. We were not yet born.
Yes, I know that. I know that. The African purchase areas was the farming land where there were farms that were being sold to black people only. There is empirical evidence to show that that land was not as fertile as the commercial farming land. But that was before the invention of irrigation, drip irrigation. Because now with drip irrigation, you can crop anywhere.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's about feeding the plant. So a lot of these pioneers had farms as well in the African purchase areas. After independence, when they were now allowed to buy in other areas, some of them, increased their land portfolio and bought in the commercial farming areas. So farming was one of them.
Okay.
And
so if it's the same people, it means that they became conglomerates. Or was that the typical business model then for black entrepreneurs?
Well, they were restricted by what they could do. I'll give you an example. In Bulawayo, the Vera family, there was a hotel called Happy Valley Hotel. The hotel was owned by the city of Bulawayo, and Mr. Vera was a social worker. And because they knew him and knew his work, they approached him to run the hotel. But because the hotel was located in black areas, they were not allowed to sell alcohol. Oh. So for him to sell alcohol, he had to literally go to white areas and purchase the alcohol illegally and bring it over.
Okay.
It sounds tragic.
What are your thoughts on this? And I want to zero in on the type of business model that these black entrepreneurs, when you hear this, what's rushing through your mind?
Well, I'm very impressed with that cohort because they were working in an environment in which they were second-class citizens. They couldn't walk into a bank and have a conversation about raising capital. They had all these challenges. A lot of the people in their own communities despised what they were doing, looked down on them. So the odds were really heavily stacked against them. But notwithstanding that, they prevailed and they built, serious fortunes, which is so you've got to take your hat off to them. And for the most part, they seemed to be quite disciplined and conservative. Mm-hmm. You don't hear stories of extravagance and flamboyance.
Would you say the same about Kombai?
Kombai in Gweru?
Yes, in terms of extravagance. He was known as a very flamboyant, colorful character.
Well, compared to the rest of the people, flamboyance is relative. Mm-hmm. When you look at the majority of people, look at these guys who are in the bus sector. The majority of them and some of the other professionals who are doing very well in the cities went and acquired real estate in Marimba Park.
All right. Okay.
And, next to Mufakose. Okay. And they built modest houses. But when you compare Marimba Park houses to Mufakose, then it seems like it's extravagance. But when you've worked hard, you deserve to live
splurge.
A certain lifestyle.
Okay, so clearly they've done well, and then they still, and this is under a white government, mm-hmm. but they still saw the need to fund and to have an alliance with the liberation struggle. Why? Why do they risk all to partake in the liberation war struggle?
There is very little evidence on players, pioneer players of that time, who were away from transportation, who funded the liberation struggle.
Okay.
The guys who were in the transportation sector had two options. You either do it because you want to continue to transact. Remember, around 78, 79, the war intensified, the war of liberation. And they found themselves in a precarious situation where sometimes a bus would be stopped and they take the bag.
Wow.
And they didn't mind because they knew that
it was going to fund the war.
It was going to fund the war. But then, what do you do in such a situation? You create readiness and preparedness. You then actually are ready when one of your buses is in the rural area somewhere. You take clothes, you take food, and you take money and you donate so that they can carry on with the business of liberating the country.
So this was at great risk to themselves and their businesses.
Of course.
Do we have any cases where they were found or they caught and there were repercussions from the colonial government?
Not that I know of, but there's a gentleman, I'm forgetting his name now. He's German, and in the early 90s he came out to Zimbabwe and actually did his thesis on the pioneer entrepreneurs.
All right.
And basically he was disappointed that after independence they started fizzling out, or those who managed to maintain their operations, the ones that were in retail or in hospitality.
Hold that thought, we'll get there. But there's an important point I want to highlight, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. Because, you know, I've studied Tiny Roland quite a bit.
Yes.
He's someone that I find very fascinating.
Yeah, you've mentioned that before.
Yeah, very fascinating character. But if you look at Tiny Roland, he more or less funded both sides. And you have a lot of the Rhodesian business people that funded both sides, that played both sides. This is the colonial government as well as the liberation war guerrillas. But post-independence, one would argue that the economy opened up so much for the white businesses. So people like Tiny actually, at his peak, it was in the late 70s, early 80s, right? Even the white business people that supported the white government did phenomenally well in the 80s. And yet we see our own black pioneer, as you call them, pioneering business people, fizzled out in the early 80s.
In the early 80s.
Yeah, what happened there?
I think it's very obvious. It's a question of ideology. Those who liberated us had a perception that running a business and making money, and your goal is to make profit, amounts to you being a petty bourgeoisie. And that is the ideology of socialism. So they came in and created conditions, particularly for the bus operators. Let me go back a little bit.
Okay.
Because a lot of the bus or the transport owners were servicing the rural areas, they lost a lot of buses and transport to the war from landmines. I know in the Matambanadzo case, they lost at least an amount of 70 to 90 buses and trucks during the war. So just before independence in 1980, around 78, 79, they sat down as an association, a transport association, with the government of the day, which was Ian Smith, and he put a rescue package in place.
All right.
So that they could replace their fleets, which I think was commendable. Independence came. Our new government was investigating, what is the status quo, what has been happening in the past, and discovered that there had been a rescue package where transport operators were reimbursed for the fleet that had been damaged during the war, and they said pay it back.
You kidding me?
That's what happened. And also, obviously...
On what basis did they pay
because
back?
they didn't want to encourage entrepreneurship because of their ideological background. It's what informed their thinking, that black people should not be doing this.
But Gloria, I'm going to push back a bit. Tiny Roland was at the zenith of his business.
But he's white.
But why would the black government treat white business people and black business people differently? Especially when black business people had actually supported them. Why would they treat them any different?
What I'm going to tell you right now is a rebuttable presumption. I've been in the war.
Just remember, we've got a 6-year-old here.
It's something it's something that's disputable.
All right.
So I'm going to make an allegation that, and this is based on Dr. Chizero, when he launched IBDC. I'm not talking about IBDC right now, but when he launched the IBDC, he gave a speech and he said, this government did not want to prop up black business because they were worried that when you achieve a critical mass of black entrepreneurs with their own money, they'll fight you at the polls because they've got money to campaign for the elections.
Was there any precedent when you look across Africa where this had happened? Because elsewhere, when you look at business people, whether it's in Tanzania or in Kenya, they were tied to the hip with the political class. Why did they think that it would be any different in Zimbabwe? Why would certainly Zimbabwean business people fund an opposition and not...
No, it's not about them necessarily funding an opposition. It's about them aspiring for political office.
So it was just a perceived worry.
It's a perceived worry, but also, you see, when you want to stay in power forever, you pauperize, you destroy, you make everybody poor.
Why wouldn't the threat be coming from white business people?
Because there is never a day in present day Zimbabwe that a white man is going to be president.
You can be a kingmaker.
Yes, they can be. They can.
So is equally a threat?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Gloria. I think the white community is not viewed as a political threat. They don't actively participate in the political space. It's unlike, if you think about Zimbabwe and you compare us to South Africa, for example. So the DA is still a significant party. They control Cape Town and the Western Cape. But you don't have a similar... And throughout, since 1980, Zimbabwe has never had a party that, or a white lobby that was powerful. They basically made it clear every time they interacted with...
but in South Africa, they've got this idea of a white monopoly capital. That's
Malema's mythology.
Yes.
Remember, we are still dealing with myth. Yeah, we're not dealing with reality. It's myth. It's all myth making, if you think about it. But the allegation of white monopoly capital is it funds Cyril. It put Cyril there, and it's the one that's actually supporting them. So why would white monopoly capital, and I'm using, the pejorative term white monopoly capital advisedly, why would it be, and why would it make an impact in South Africa and not in Zimbabwe? Why would politicians in Zimbabwe of a similar hue to the Malemas and ANC, why would they think that the white monopoly capital in Zimbabwe is benign, while white monopoly capital in South Africa is lethal.
Yeah, so I think, so firstly, remember this is 1980, so South Africa is still under apartheid. It had another 15 years to go. And the liberation movement's ideology was Marxist-Leninist. So they're concerned about, threat. They're paranoid, actually. So concerned is not...
Paranoid.
It's not a strong enough word. They're paranoid about who might challenge them. And so independent thinking, entrepreneurs, because there's something that I think all entrepreneurs have in common, which is a rebellious spirit. Because for you to identify a gap in the market and believe that you can actually exploit it, right? It's an unconventional view, because if it was obvious to everybody, that gap wouldn't be there.
Everybody would be doing it.
So entrepreneurs by nature, they're these rebellious, audacious human beings, and anybody with a Marxist-Leninist worldview would find them threatening. And if you actually fast forward to 2002,
please don't.
Okay,
we'll get there. But I think it's a nice way for us to talk about the new business people that actually arose post-independence. So we've got the pioneer in business class, but you have people like Roger Boka, for example. He arose, we could say, in the early 80s, the Chidaus, those kind of business people. Would you like to speak to, where was the gap? How did they manage to find space?
Well, I would not actually locate them in the first decade. I wouldn't. Okay. In fact, if I were to talk, generally speaking, about entrepreneurship in Zimbabwe, I would classify it into 4 categories. The first one is the pioneer group, the ones before independence. And then I'll take the first decade, which I would refer to as the socialist decade. That's 1980 to 1990. Okay. Then I'll take the second decade, where ISAP is being instituted, deregulation of the banking sector.
That's the third period.
That is the third period. And I would refer to that as the reorientation phase, or the reorientation decade, because now we need to understand what informed ISAP.
All right, don't rush.
Yeah, and then the last decade, I would take it from year 2000, with the beginning of the land reform program, all the way to now.
Okay, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But I just want us to focus on what you have now termed, and I suppose that's what we will call it, the socialism decade.
Yes.
Okay, and that this is the decline of the pioneer entrepreneurs. Why is it a decline? It's a decline because primarily they're a threat to the political class. Also, socialism meant that government does a lot of the work. But if you read Miles Tandy's book, which we have done, the Mujuru one.
Oh, okay.
There's an interesting, from a business perspective, there's something that's interesting there, because you have the Major General who gets into bed or gets into business with the white guys who were on the other side of the wall. They get into business, and I think Colonel Dyke is one important man during that period. But there are a lot of tenders, army tenders, that he's giving to his white business people. And it's a big worry for me.
Why are you worried?
I'm worried because these are the people who are supposed to be the purveyors of black empowerment, black emancipation. And yet here they are going into business with people who are killing black people.
We don't trust each other, Tinashe, as black people. We don't. We feel safer transacting with people who are not within our social class. Look at the Zuma situation in South Africa. Are you telling me that there were no black people that he could have transacted with? We tend to we feel comfortable transacting with outsiders.
Okay, fantastic.
And you've talked about a general here. We cannot classify him as an entrepreneur because he's part of the political class.
The leeching class.
I don't know about that. You are saying it.
But you're by yourself there. We're not joining you in that characterization.
You are saying it.
Okay, but there's an interesting thing why the socialism bit is Tanzania was more socialist than Zimbabwe, and yet they were still supporting black business people. Why would the Nyerere government not see black business people as a threat?
Well,
and yet the Mugabe government would see black people as a threat.
Are you able to tell me right now of a Tanzanian business person who achieved beyond anybody's imagination? If they supported it, it was little mom and pop operations and so forth. What I would like to see from Zimbabweans is for us to have a critical mass of entrepreneurs who don't only operate within the confines of Zimbabwe, but who go beyond. Because we've got the skill sets, we've got the entrepreneurial abilities, and I think there should have been more strives out there, or more Dagimunatsis who took Bank ABC to another world.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely get there. I'm still worried, Rufaro, because government is clearly killing the goose that lays the golden egg. You have these entrepreneurs who, for what we've already classified them as pioneering entrepreneurs, did phenomenally well in a white government, and in a black government would have done even better and who would have produced enough tax for the government itself. And government is actually going out of the way. So it's one thing to ignore them, but government is actually going out of their way to kill the goose that lays the golden egg.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we see the rise of the informal sector. So the numbers here are that the informal sector in Zimbabwe was about 10% in 1980. And in 1990, it was 20%. So that's the pauperization of our business class.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think it's an ideology problem, right? If you have a Marxist-Leninist mindset, firstly, you think all the country's problems can be solved by a government program.
Yes.
And then secondly, when you see entrepreneurs emerging and doing well independently of government, you see them as a political threat. And this is what has informed that socialist decade. I think we tried to reform in the 90s. I get the sense that we are slowly turning away from Marxist-Leninism.
I think let's stick to that period.
But certainly in the 80s, the mindset was because remember, the Soviet Union only collapsed in 1991. So communism was still very much in vogue. And, the Soviets sponsored the liberation movement. The Mao government sponsored the liberation movement. Mao only died in 1976. So the 80s, socialist ideas were still very much in vogue. And I think it's a case study in how the wrong ideology can hold a country back.
And also, to add to that, during that decade, when the minds of decision makers in government was about them having interventionist policies, it meant that they were crowding out the existing entrepreneurs and potential new entrants. So by doing that, they were actually protecting white monopoly capital.
Wow.
That's why they were thriving.
Okay, so I want to put another dimension to this because it happened in the 80s. Mm-hmm. We were too young to really conceptualize this, but you lived through this.
You were not born yet.
I was born. We were.
Oh yes, you had a toddler.
We were toddlers,
yes,
and we were running around. But I remember vividly.
Some of us remained so.
You haven't outgrown the 80s. No. But I remember vividly in 1987, and I remember it because, it was that song which, yes. And it was Maurice Gumbo who had hanged himself. And, later on we'll discover that it was the Willowgate scandal. So if you think about it, there was corruption. And I don't know about the colonial government and its corruption, but clearly the state, you then had these individuals that were extremely corrupt, from Willowgate to a whole lot of grain.
I'm going to push back on Willowgate being an example of extreme corruption. Because if you think about it in the context of what we see happening today...
Well, no, this is in the 80s. I mean, a minister hanged himself because he felt that he had gone against the leadership code at that particular time, mm-hmm. right? And he felt gravely aggrieved and that he had embarrassed himself. Or am I reading it correctly? Because maybe there were something to it. But I want to contextualize it that the black business people are no longer getting the business. The state is feeding its own because those politicians are now business people. That's why they're engaged in a lot of these activities, corrupt or otherwise. What were the feelings of the black working class during that period when you were experiencing Willowgate, when you were experiencing this new corruption? What were the running themes and thoughts around it at that particular time?
My sense is we were all still dizzy from gratefulness that we got our political independence in 1980. We are no longer under the clutches of the colonialists. And when you look at Willowgate, it was actually mild. And it's unfortunate that, Mr. Nyagumbo took his own life. But that is expected in a situation where you are curtailing normal behavior, the normal behavior of people. People then find loopholes to do this sort of thing. But I think we were still dizzy from independence. It's towards the end.
Honeymoon phase.
The honeymoon phase.
We are very forgiving.
Exactly. But it was towards the end of the 80s that the labor movement started making noises because there were now job losses. A lot of people were now moving into the informal sector, and potential entrepreneurs who were seeing opportunities were realizing that government is not creating an enabling environment for them to enter. That's when people were now thinking about organizing themselves to actually lobby government to say policies need to change.
I want us to correctly frame that because you preempted the next question, which is because the way you have described the 80s, and these are your words, decline of the pioneer entrepreneurs and the emergence of new activism. So this is business activism. And
it's labor activism.
Labor, yes. So that's why I said I want us to correctly frame it. So the activism from labor, we can see it. The activism from business, where is it coming from? Is it we also want to eat?
They wanted to participate. If participation leads to eating, it's all right.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with that because you've worked for it. But they were raring to go, but the government had not reviewed policies of the colonial regime that prevented black people from entering certain sectors. Okay. And as we then move into the reorientation period, starting with ISA in 1991.
Let's not get into that.
Okay.
But so for us, what I'm more interested in is this new activism. So from Labour, I can see how they caucused and where the activism was happening. It was, you looked at your payslip and you were like, hey, we need to do something about it. From a black business people, what was the conversation in, at dinner? What were you thinking? Were you thinking, damn, these socialist Marxists, look at what they're doing to us. We need to fight back. Or was it a question of let's engage government and let's see the way forward? What was the interaction at that time?
I think a lot of potential or existing business people had lobbied government individually and realized that unless you are organized into a business organization formation, you are not going to have a voice. What was very painful for entrepreneurs was the lack of a competitive environment for them to enter into.
Oh, that's very...
Yeah, unfair trading practices were rife from the white monopoly capital, if you want to borrow Malema's terminology.
We really need to improve on that.
That's true.
So people started to organize themselves into formations that would be head by government. Okay. And also government, I think, was now increasingly realizing that this business of control and wanting to focus on non-tradable, the managing creation, development of non-tradable goods doesn't work. And they were now consulting with international organizations.
Well, they were forced to.
They were forced to.
Because of ESOP, and we'll get into that.
But I've got a question. I'm curious about something that you said about the emergence of the labor movement. Because I think around about that time, the end of the 80s, going into the 90s, we diverged from the Chinese in an important way. We went, in my opinion, regressive, where we,
created state. We actually wanted.
No, from a labor perspective, we created all these rules that make it incredibly difficult for employers. It's difficult to fire. You've got all these terms and conditions around employment that are skewed in favor of the employee, right? Whereas the Chinese, they have 996, where they work from 9 in the morning to 9 p.m. 6 days a week in incredibly tough conditions, and that's normal over there, right? So why, in your view, why was the government willing to kowtow to labor in a way that even the Chinese, who claim to be communists, weren't interested in doing?
You see, labor is only part of the what is the phrase that I want to use? It's a contribution to production. It's not the production itself. But also remember, the ZCTU was far much more organized than any other bloc in the economy.
Okay.
So they were the first ones to make noises about their needs. And government was more willing to listen to them, because what they wanted, if you've got a government that is anti the private sector for black people, when they are coming up with these draconian rules about how labor should be treated at an organizational level, government would therefore be willing to listen to them, because they are not a threat they didn't see them as a threat only until Changirai then set up MDC.
All right. That's later on and we'll get there. Okay, so now we enter the period 3, and these are your words, and I quote, "The hope in the horizon decade." So this is 1990 to 2000.
It's the reorientation decade.
Yes, you call it the rise of the new breed of entrepreneurs and the beginning of its failure. But let's look at, first of all, just finish the activism. And here we want to talk of the IBDC, which is the Indigenous Business Development Center.
Yes.
Tell us the nuances and the colorful characters who were at that time forming that. And clearly this was a new activism. What was happening there?
Well, the most vocal organization was Labour. And the other voices from the beginning of 1980 towards the end were stunted, right? So essentially, people started to gather to organize blocks that would lobby government, and this is how the IBDC was formed. And some of the founders of the IBDC, you might know them. Strive was the Secretary General.
The president was
Kemi Siziba.
What, Ben
was, I think, one of the committee members. John Mapondera also. There was a Lupepe guy from Bulawayo. There was
Delma Lupepe. Okay.
Yes, Delma Lupepe. Then there was Messi Zinyama. Messi was working for Barclays.
All right.
And she wanted to set up a small business. And she could not even access the funding when she was a banker herself. So when these conversations was taking place, she joined the formation of the IBDC, and that's how it was formed. It was formed.
And immediately there were benefits. I mean, the government then released, we'll call it a venture fund, 100 million.
But it wasn't released to the IBDC.
All right. What happened?
During that time, we still had, the banking sector had not been deregulated. There were still 5 commercial banks. It was Barclays, Standard Bank, Zim.Bank.
Stanbic, what is
Stanbic? And I think CBZ. Yeah, CBZ. There were 5 commercial banks because I remember during that time, the donor community was now looking at how they can participate in this reorientation, because ISAP was all about reorienting government from moving away from non-tradable goods to tradable goods. So the donor community were coming up with programs and incentives to assist. So as part of the lobbying, government decided that because one of the thorny issues that entrepreneurs of the early 90s were finding was the traditional practices of the banking sector. Traditional banks have always viewed black people as high risk. Africa, generally speaking, if you read a book by a Japanese writer called Fukuyama, he classified different locations in the world is high
this is the
trust.
End of history.
Yeah, it's called Trust, actually, that particular book. And, Zimbabwe and the rest of Africa, or at least certain parts of Africa, are considered low trust environments. And when you look at the banking sector, you walk into a bank, you don't get the credit. So that particular time, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe owned a company that was called the Credit Guarantee Company. And essentially the role of the Credit Guarantee Company was, if we give money to Rufaro, and we are not so sure, we really don't want to give Rufaro money, but we are going to give Rufaro money. We will send the application through to the Credit Guarantee Company, and if the Credit Guarantee can guarantee that loan, we'll give Rufaro money.
Okay.
But who was funding the Credit Guarantee Company? It was the Reserve Bank itself and the 5 commercial banks. So they would put money to this guarantee fund, and it was headed up by a Muchati guy. So government, the lobby from IBDC was, we can't access credit to finance our operations. So government then put in the first 100 million, and all those loans were guaranteed by the Credit Guarantee Company. And the clever people went, got the loans, put it on the money market. Other people went and took loans, did genuine business. Others married second wives. Others bought cars and so forth and so on. Because at some point I had the opportunity to do some work as a consultant for the Royal Danish Embassy under Danida, and it was a program of sensitizing the banking community, the branch managers throughout the country, on lending to women. It was a women's program funded by, no, it wasn't a Danish program, it was a Canadian CEDA program. And that's when we, got access to a lot of what had happened to that 100 million. But when that 100 million was put in to the banking sector, it became quickly obvious that it was inadequate.
All right.
Because take, for example, just take 200 people accessing 500,000 each. It's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone. So immediately thereafter, they put in another 300,000. 300 million into the banking system. And it was disbursed to black people. I'm very excited about this period because a lot of people, when they criticize government, they forget that at some point in its life, this current government tried to have goodwill, and they put in that money. Yes, it was a drop in the ocean, and a lot of people took the money and failed, but there was a critical mass of people who took the money and succeeded. Had that money not had been put into place, we would not have a crop of some of the business people we see surviving today.
Absolutely.
I've got a question there. Sorry, Tinashe. Something that you said piqued my interest, which is, Zimbabwe and much of Africa is considered a low trust environment. And I suspect, other parts of the world like Japan or are considered high trust environments. And so, what did you learn when you read that about why places like Africa are low trust environments?
I think I can't answer that question with one answer. I think it's a question whose answers are very layered. When I was in banking myself, we were issuing loans at the Small Business Services Division for Zim Bank in the early 90s. And one thing I noticed was when black people fail to pay, it's in our culture, it's inherent in our culture to feel ashamed. How do I face Rufaro and Tinashe and tell them that I failed to pay? And your reasons are genuine, but the bank wants its money. But what they fail to understand is when you show up and you tell your story, They've got solutions. They can rearrange the terms of the loan. Black people, the majority of people don't do that. They shy away, and then it becomes a bad debt. And then next minute, the lawyers are by your gate and they are selling your house. So those issues talk to you being a low trust person. You can't be trusted because you are not available to tell us your story. Why aren't you paying? Tell us your story, because when you show up and you tell your story 10 times, they are happy that you are showing up. But when you don't show up and you've got a credible reason, then... So I find that there are many layers around why we fail to conduct ourselves with honesty. But then again, we discovered when we, with Muchati, when we were moving around the country talking to managers of the 5 commercial banks, that there is that time, I don't know whether this is still true today, they discovered that women generally tend to be more honest than men. And men would go and get loans, not pay for them, but then if they are married, they would push their wife in front to go and get the loan. And then before you know it, the loan becomes hardcore, and that loan can be paid. Right. Only when they dig into it, they realize that
it was the man.
It wasn't the woman's business, it was the man's business.
We'll get into that later.
Again, it talks to low trust.
Yeah. We'll get into that later. Sorry to take you back. Well, I'm not actually sorry.
Was your ego being wounded by this revelation about men not being as trustworthy?
I thought, you know what, let's move on forward quickly. But, you know, ESOP brought about this opening of the economy, but also more importantly, we had a new governor. We had Moyana. Right. Oh no, Moyana was 1980 to 1991. And this was Tsumba.
I'm not sure now, I don't remember.
So 1992, it's now Tsumba, and Tsumba opens up the financial services sector.
Yes.
But we'll talk about that. But something that you were keen on and actually quite instrumental in, it's Empretac. And you called it an initiative of the UN. Maybe you can tell us, what was Empretac?
What is Empretac?
Oh, it's still there, yeah.
Oh, it's still there. It's still very much here in Zimbabwe. A lady and a friend by the name of Busibango is heading it up. She took after Muringi and Tsitsi.
Okay.
And she's been running it ever since. And she is a legend to be able to continue the operations of Empretac in this environment. Having said that, what is Empretac? Many years ago, I don't know how many years, I've forgotten now, Management Systems International, a Washington-based consulting company, did research, I think in over 30 countries in the world, and discovered certain indicators about entrepreneurship. For example, one of them was, if you are firstborn in a family, you are likely to be an entrepreneur, that kind of thing. There were traits that they came up with.
Okay.
So they came up with what they call within Empretac the 30 personal entrepreneurial competencies. They are classified, I think, into 6, with each one with 5 components, if I remember correctly.
Don't worry about me.
All right. So they collaborated with, I think, UNCTAD, another arm of the United Nations, and decided that they were going to roll this out throughout the world. So by the time they came to Zimbabwe, that period coincided with ESA.
Okay.
Essentially, Anne-Marie Chizero, Dr. Chizero's daughter, was based in New York. She was working for UNDP, and she was asked to come into Zimbabwe and secure a local consultant through UNDP. When Dr. Carlos Lopez was the res rep for the United Nations, that's how I got to work with Anne-Marie in setting up Empretac. Essentially, we were given a box, a big box with the tools, and our responsibility was to mobilize stakeholders. And one of the stakeholders that we mobilized was the Zimbabwe Investment Center, because it participated in the setting up of Empretac, the banking sector, you name it. And
so there was a lot of support for it.
There was a lot of support for it. And remember, a lot of young professionals were now seeing the light. Everybody was talking about getting into business. It was going to be a private sector-led growth. And, small and medium-sized enterprises were going to be at the center of this development. And Empretac came in. We then set it up, hired a director and a deputy director, Hatush Muringi and Sitsima Siwa, and handed over. And essentially, what Empretac is all about is about training. You complete a questionnaire, and that questionnaire is structured in a manner where it assesses your competencies against those 30 entrepreneurial competencies. And then it also assesses your weaknesses. And the training is to elevate your weaknesses to get to the level of your strengths.
Okay.
And it's a program that works. It's been tried and tested. I think it's in over 30 or 40 countries in the world. And people who've gone through that workshop are called Empretacos. So you can easily form a business organization where you meet, share knowledge around your businesses, your sectors, networks, share your connections. And one of the people I remember very well who attended, I think, the third training workshop for Empretac was Nigel Chanakira.
Yeah, he does speak about it.
Yeah, and
fondly as well.
Yes, and he did extremely well when
absolutely.
Yes.
So, can you please help us to experience the verve of how these golden era started and Empretac, and you were part of these professionals. So, unlike the pioneering entrepreneurs, these were professionals who were trained CAs, economists, bankers, who were thinking now of taking the entrepreneurial route. What was the era like? What were dinner parties like? What were people talking about?
We were going to take Zimbabwe to another world, basically. We saw ourselves as being the hub of Africa, like the Switzerland of Europe. We genuinely believed that the thinking within decision makers who matter, and I'm going to underscore who matter, because in Zimbabwe, we've got decision makers who hold office and they hold titles, but they don't make decisions. We thought the reorientation that had been introduced through ISAP was going to hold.
All right.
So we were very positive. I moved from the University of Zimbabwe, went into banking for a little while, and then went into consulting. People were setting up businesses. There were so many initiatives to assist. Like I remember one initiative from the Danish was to link Danish business with Zimbabwean business. I was at the forefront of that, and we linked so many Zimbabwean businesses. And these initiatives were coming with grants and with technology transfer from Denmark to Zimbabwe. And a lot of the businesses where this private sector development program took place succeeded until, I guess, 2008.
Okay, so a lot of that, and before you can come in, yeah, what I gather is there was a spirit. And I don't know if you can speak to the spirit as a metaphysical thing, but there was certainly a verb or an energy. I think today's parlance would be energy. There was a bit of energy where everybody was just geared. You know what? I think the government is sincere in what ESAP, which is opening up the economy. Look, the banking sector is now opening up. A lot of the, Vingirai started Intermarket. A lot of the banks were opening up. So there was this idea that maybe government has changed. That's what I'm getting from Gloria. That maybe government has changed and maybe the socialist ghost
has been exercised.
It's been exercised. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I tend to agree with that assessment. If you think about the early 1990s, it was actually not just, it was a turning point in the world in that, so from a global perspective, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. The experiment in China under Deng of reform, of opening up to markets and allowing entrepreneurship and businesses to flourish in China,
was working.
It was working. The results were there for all to see that China was, was moving in a different direction, and it was positive. So from our perch here, we wanted to get onto that bandwagon of opening up, of liberalizing, of promoting entrepreneurship. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you had ESAP and then you had the emergence of Ringirai and Intermarket, of Makoni and his colleagues at NMB and Nyemba Trust and all of this energy, because it was part of it was a global momentum that the experiment between free market capitalism versus socialism, the results were in.
It was a new world. There's an interesting anecdote that you shared, and I want our viewers to hear it, especially around this time. And you were setting up Empretac, and you were pregnant. And would you like to tell us that story? Because I thought it's an interesting anecdote that really spells out the times.
Oh, we were young and we were energetic and we were very excited, but we were also of childbearing age. And I had met Douglas Munatsi at Zimbank and we just hit it off. So we were very close. He was even one of my eldest daughter's godfather. So on this particular night, he visited. He was one of that. It was a couple where they would just rock up and say, "Cook, we want to eat," and I would do the same at their house. So they came home and I was in pain. I was pregnant, fully pregnant, due any time. And I was working. I had just come back from the offices, the Empretac offices that we were setting up with Anne-Marie. And so after dinner, they suggested that after they leave, I must sit in a hot bath because apparently a hot bath expedites the coming of the child. So I listened. They were my friends, so I listened. So I ran the bath and sat into it. Lo and behold, 3:00 a.m. in the morning, I was at Mbuyane. I had not registered to give birth anywhere. So, thank God for, public hospitals. They are always available to take anybody anytime. So I ran to Mbuyane.
You wouldn't want to do that today. I promise you.
Gave birth to my son at 3 a.m. The doctor was around, so I begged the doctor and I said I need to go home. By 8:00 I was at home. This was Saturday morning. Sunday I rested. Then on Monday morning I'm driving. It was Union Avenue that time before it was renamed Kwame Nkrumah, and there was parking. I haven't been back to that parking. I don't know whether it still exists.
Yeah,
so I
still
bumped into Dagi, and Dagi says, but what are you doing here? And I said, I gave birth. And he said, you're not serious. I said, wait, I'm parking the car. Parked the car, stood outside. He hit my stomach. He said, what? There's no baby here. And I was going to the office to work. Well, this is quite controversial. So sometimes when I hear people say that they need 6 months time off for maternity leave, I actually think it's a luxury. You know, at that time we used to run.
Maybe that's the metaphysical force. It was the moment.
It was the moment.
The moment that you wanted to be part of it. You felt like, you know what, I'm letting the team down if I don't do this.
No, it was only the two of us in the office. But also I had the energy. And can you believe it? It was 31 years ago.
Unbelievable.
Can you believe it? And we did it. And nobody died. The baby is still alive. You saw him the other day.
Yeah.
And that was the energy that was prevalent across
the time.
There was such goodwill about Zimbabwe. You know, let me tell you something. If there is a bunch of citizens in Africa that I have seen who love their country, they are Zimbabweans. So much goodwill. We want to make it work. We want to change the landscape. We want growth. We want to create jobs, but in the processes, we set up our businesses. We want to make money. We want to make a difference. And I think we are handing over to you guys to do that.
Okay, on that note, because the producer is jumping up and down.
Is jumping up and down?
Yeah.
Because we can definitely keep going.
But yeah, we definitely, and we actually do need to, because we're actually halfway through.
Oh, we're halfway through.
Yeah, we're somewhere in the 90s. So what we will do is we'll have a part 2. And in the part 2, we'll then continue from the 90s right through to the current. If you would allow us...
yeah, when you're ready. We
will have a part 2, and we can then continue, because this is very interesting. And I think
absolutely.
It's one of those where we need to really pace it rather than rush into it.
For sure.
Yeah, so just too many anecdotes, but very important. Viewers, please let us know what you think. I think this was quite illuminating and riveting in every way possible. Gloria, thank you very much for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you for having me.
How was your Campari?
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
And you're still...
Yes, this is delightful. It's called the chocolate block. It's like drinking a delicious liquid chocolate, but with a red wine flavor.
Oh, fantastic. Remember the question that we asked at the beginning, which was rhetorical? Well, we haven't. This was just part 1. We will continue part 2. But just remember this question. And the question is, failure of the black entrepreneurship in Zimbabwe, who is to blame? Just keep that question as we go through part 2. But I found this very, very, very illuminating. And I look forward to Gloria coming back. But let's keep the conversation going. These are very important things. These are very important discussions that we need to have as policymakers, as business people, as society in general. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful evening and a great weekend. See you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.